Hello everybody. So that's the name of my project, and I received the grant in 2008, but the work really started until 2009. And as Dr. Arrambide already said, I come from the Neurology Institute in Mexico City, where Dr. Teresa Corona and Dr. Jose Flores were my supervisors. And then I went to the Multiple Sclerosis Center of Catalonia, where my supervisors are, of course, Dr. Xavier Montalban and above all, Martin Torre, with whom I've been working closely all this time. So yeah, everything started very formally, but after a couple of days, we started being a little bit friendlier. After a couple of drinks, everybody was happier. And I think the part that sealed the deal was this Mexican cantina were inviting Dr. Montalban and Dr. Tinture to go, so I think that's what convinced them about doing this project together with me. So my project is about biomarkers, and biomarkers can be useful for very different aspects of a certain disease. But in our case, we were mostly concerned about conversion to multiple sclerosis. So the objective of this project was to determine the value of selected biomarkers, either in CSF or in serum, as prognostic factors for clinical conversion and for disability progression in patients with a CIS. So the first step had to do with a screening phase in which, from a CIS cohort that's been ongoing in Barcelona for many years now, we selected patients with at least 2 years of follow-up and divided them into two extreme groups. The first one was made up of patients who had 3 or 4 background criteria on baseline MRI, positive oligoclonal bands, and conversion to clinically definite MS at the time of selection. And the other group was basically the opposite, patients who didn't comply with any Barkov criteria on MRI, who had negative oligoclonal bands, and at the time of follow-up they had not converted to multiple sclerosis. So from these patients we measured certain biomarkers, which are these. The last two, well, we had some technical issues, so we forgot about them, and we centered on the first 4 that you see there. So as for the results, the first one that we checked was ferritin A, which, as you can see there, we didn't see any differences between patients who convert and those who don't. And then we selected latch and neurofilaments, and in this case, as you can see, there was a significant difference between those who converted and those who didn't. Then we tested neurofilament heavy subunits, in which we didn't find any differences either, and so was the case with GFAP. So we focused a little bit more on the NFL levels, and we started making a little bit of correlations to see what is going on with this case. And although we saw a trend regarding disability progression and the NFL levels, this was not statistically significant, at least with the sample size that we had at the moment. And as for the magnetic resonance variables, we divided them into neurodegeneration variables, and at this point we have just analyzed the change of the brain parenchymal fraction in 1 year, and we can see, as you can know, that there were some correlations. And when it comes to the inflammation variables, we saw very interesting correlations. MRI at baseline repeated at year 1 and at year 5 for number of volume of lesions of T2, number of gadolinium enhancing lesions, and number of new T2 lesions. So what we can see is that we see some interesting results only for the NFL levels in our case. So what we want to do next is validate these results in a non-selected cohorts. Instead of focusing on 2 different extreme groups, we're just going to see an unselected group of patients and see how all these things work, and see, above all, if the NFL are independent predictors of conversion to CDMS. And of course, there have been a couple of spin-offs from this project, and one had to do with a collaboration with a group in Israel, in which they made this panel of antibodies that are measuring serum against lichens. And we can see that those patients who were positive to this antibody panel converted to multiple sclerosis earlier than those who were negative. And this was above all during the first 5 years of the disease. And the other thing was that when we were doing the multivariate analysis, it turns out that this panel is an independent predictor of conversion when compared to a certain number of MRI variables, although not when compared to oligoclonal bands. And the other thing that we wanted to see is whether it is useful to measure NMO-IgG in all patients who present with optic neuritis or myelitis, independently of whether the clinic is suggestive or not of MS or of NMO. So we evaluated several groups from the same CIS cohort that we were talking about before. Group 1 was what we defined as an NMO phenotype, in which the patient started with a CIS that would involve the optic nerve or the spinal cord and had at least a second event involving either of these topographies. Then we had a group also from the CIS cohort that was working as a negative control, and we had a few patients with NMO according to the 2006 criteria. And the determination was made through indirect immunofluorescence. So the results that we had was that in comparison, although the NMO group was very small, in comparison to those, we had very few patients who converted, who had NMO-IgG antibodies in the NMO phenotype from the CIS, but also in the negative control group. When looking at these 5 patients in particular, 4 of them really behaved as multiple sclerosis, and only one was really someone who eventually developed an NMO. So what we concluded this was that it is not necessary to make it a routine examination unless there's a high index of suspicion. And as my current status, well, I'm still in Barcelona because the project is still ongoing and we still have a few things to do regarding this project. And we have made a few publications already regarding this project, several journals here, and also some extra project here in which Gavin Tour was the main author. So my contribution there was a little bit minor, but still as part of the work in the group. And we still have 3 more projects that we're submitting or preparing to submit regarding all these biomarkers. And in congresses, we've been lucky to have several oral presentations and, of course, several posters. And as for my future plans, well, I'd like to finish this project and then we will continue with some markers and MRI. And maybe we can put everything together, we'll see about it, and then I'll have to finish my PhD with all this thing. So there are no conclusions yet. So I want to thank everybody there at the unit, and of course Barcelona, as you can see there in the lower corner. And of course I want to thank my family and friends in Mexico, and well, the MSIF is also useful for meeting people at a more personal level, so I want to thank that lab there for putting up with me for the last 2 years. And well, thank you to everybody there at the SEMCAP.